How much is this moment worth? $100? 1,000? The moments of your life are priceless. Are you saving them on the right film? Kodak Gold. No other film gives you truer, more consistent color, picture after picture.
Kodak. A company so synonymous with cameras that for a long time, there was the concept of the Kodak moment. Things you'd want to remember. Family gatherings, birthdays, weddings. These were all Kodak moments. And by that they meant, take a picture. Take the just take the picture so you can buy more film. And Kodak was the dominant force when it came to, well, pictures for so long, many decades. And yet, in recent times, they've fallen off. Some people think they even went under. That's not true. They do still exist and are still a multi-million-dollar company, but they're not what they once were. And if you ask most people, they'll tell you that the reason for this is that Kodak didn't understand investing in digital technology. Digital cameras were on the rise, and they didn't do that, and that was the reason. And this story about their fall just isn't true. No, seriously, it's wrong. It is a blatant, horrific misunderstanding of what actually happened to Kodak, because they did embrace digital technology. But if that's so, then why did they fall from grace? Well, I'll explain, because that's what I'm here for. We have fun with this. In order to fully understand Kodak, we of course have to go back all the way to the beginning, to 1892, May 23rd. Indeed, Kodak is that old, though the origins of the company go back even before that, to a man named George Eastman. In 1880, Eastman entered a partnership with a man named Henry Strong, and together they would found the Eastman Dry Plate Company on January 1st, 1881. Strong served as president and Eastman was the treasurer, and given the name, they sold dry plates. And a dry plate is probably something that most of you aren't even remotely familiar with, but it's a method for taking pictures. It refers to a gelatin silver process, which is the most commonly used chemical process in black and white photography. The dry plate gelatin process was an improvement on the collodion wet plate process that people were using between the 1850s and the 1880s. Those had to be exposed and developed immediately after coating. There was no waiting, but dry plates were different. They were an improvement. Not as good as what we have now, obviously, but they were an improvement. Both utilized photographic plates, the precursor to film, which even my younger viewers may not even know what that is. We're all getting so old. These plates used the light-sensitive emulsion of silver salts, and that was coated on a glass plate, generally of a thinner variety than, say, your windows. And like I said, the gelatin dry plates were better than the old wet ones, because you didn't have to deal with them immediately after you took the picture. You could just wait, not rush like a crazy person. But even with this development and success, Eastman felt there must be a better way, because he was still using glass plates and they were large and cumbersome, so he started looking into a newer process, roll film, sometimes called cartridge film, due to its resemblance to a shotgun cartridge. The first roll film camera was invented by a farmer in Wisconsin named Peter Houston in 1881. And Eastman felt there was huge potential in this particular way of taking pictures. Peter Houston's younger brother, David, who had filed most of the patents and also held the patent for the first holders for flexible film roll, originally licensed them to Eastman, but then sold the patent outright for $5,000 in 1889. Even before that, Eastman was working on his own technology to take advantage of film. The company had been reincorporated as Eastman Dry Plate and Film Company. And in 1885, Eastman was working on the first practical film roll holder, alongside William Walker. And that same year, he was able to patent a form of paper film that he referred to as American film. In America. Eastman continued tinkering away for a while, and he hired a chemist, Henry Reichenbach, to try to develop improvements to the film, because he was also looking for quality here. Further experiments eventually led to an 1889 patent for what was known as nitrocellulose film. It was a pivotal development in the technology. It was much better than previous film had been. and the company continued to grow, developing more and more technology and selling more. They were reincorporated several more times, and in November of 1889 they renamed it to just the Eastman Company. And Eastman had been working on cameras to utilize the film too. The film was one thing, but they also needed to sell cameras to utilize it. In 1888, the first Kodak camera was patented by him. This was a box camera with a fixed focused lens on the front and no viewfinder at all. Two V-shaped silhouettes at the top aided in aiming in the direction of the subject. The camera was sold for $25, and it was preloaded with a film roll for 100 exposures. Actually, not that bad of a deal, but of course they had to develop them, and at the time there weren't a lot of locations that could do that. So there was a setup where you could mail the film to Eastman's headquarters in Rochester with $10 as a processing fee. The camera would be returned with prints, negatives, and a brand new roll of film, and it was an astonishing success. They advertised with the slogan, "You press the button, we do the rest." And on May 23rd, 1892, another round of capitalization occurred. And it was at that point that the company was renamed one more time to Eastman Kodak. Though most people don't even say the Eastman part, or know it at all. They just say Kodak. As for the name Kodak, well, according to George Eastman himself, he just liked the letter K? Yeah. He's quoted as saying that it seems a strong, incisive sort of letter. Okay, whatever. He worked with his mom, Maria, to come up with the name Kodak. He explained that he was looking for a name that should be short, easy to pronounce, but not resemble any other name or be associated with anything else. And he trademarked it in 1888. It seems the name was good because, most of us recognize the name Kodak. It's associated with cameras. And nothing else. With the success of their initial camera line, as well as the film, they grew very rapidly. And early on, Eastman realized that the film was cheaper to make, and therefore had a higher profit margin than the cameras. So he wasn't necessarily worried about competitors making other cameras. He was concerned about controlling the film market, as well as marking it up to the point that wasn't completely unreasonable, but a lot more than they necessarily needed to. It's known as a razor and blades model, where a single item is sold at a very low price in order to increase sales of a complementary item, consumable supplies. Their name Razor and Blades comes from the, razor and blades market. Razors in and of themselves generally aren't marked up that much, but the blades are. And you need blades because, blades dull, you need to replace them. It was the same thing for Kodak. The cameras weren't really marked up hardly at all, but the film was, and it worked. And they continued doing exceedingly well, even working with the military, establishing a photographic school in Rochester to train pilots in aerial reconnaissance. Their success and their dominance became closely tied to the city of Rochester. Most of their employees, lived there, and they were one of the centerpieces of what's known as welfare capitalism.
To capitalism!
During the 1910s and 1920s. It's a concept that Twitter denies ever existed at all. They are wrong, as Twitter often is. Welfare capitalism is a concept underneath capitalism, obviously, but it includes social welfare policies or the practice of businesses providing welfare services for their own employees. It's sometimes referred to as industrial paternalism, and generally centered around industries that employed very skilled labor. It peaked in the mid-20th century, and it's actually a very, very effective business model. Happy employees usually means a good product, as some companies today need to remember. And indeed, Kodak was an exceptional place to work. They were good for the community around them, and they implemented a lot of different worker benefit programs, such as welfare funds to provide workmen's compensation in 1910, something nearly unheard of back then, as well as a profit-sharing program for every single employee that worked for them in 1912. Eastman himself even sold a large portion of stock in the company in 1919 to the company employees below the market value, basically giving it to them. Even after Eastman himself retired, the company carried on his idea of, hey, maybe we should take care of our workers. They offered life insurance, disability benefits, and retirement annuity plans for employees in 1928. These sorts of benefits are considered excellent by today's standards, but for 1928, they were amazing. Everyone wanted to work for Kodak, and more importantly, the skilled people, the really good workers, the ones the company wanted, really wanted to work for them. As such, they wound up with the best of the best, in a mutually beneficial arrangement. Other employers in Rochester followed along with Kodak's business practices, increasing their own wages and benefits in order to remain competitive. Eastman himself felt that this was the way to go. Not only was it a moral thing to do, but it also served the interests of the company. For one thing, he was just terrified of labor unions, but he believed that it could be avoided by simply treating his workers fairly. If he offered better compensation than generally received by union workers, it would deter any union organizing. There would be no reason to unionize. There'd be no reason to strike, because, well, the company was treating the workers right. And he's correct. As it turns out, the best way to avoid unions is, in fact, not treat your workers like crap. I know, it's this weird thing. As it turns out, you can, in fact, have full-tilt free market capitalism and not treat your workers like crap. It's amazing, just wonderful. Although it is probably worth mentioning that he was a bit of a product of his time. See, employment opportunities with Kodak in those days weren't extended to everybody who lived in Rochester. Under him, they didn't hire African Americans, Jews, and even Catholic individuals, which means I would be excluded despite being white as snow. Though he did hire women, 1/3 of the employees were female. And he incorporated a system of family hiring. Children of employees would be hired to follow along in their parents' footsteps. And in Eastman's mind, it reinforced the concept of an industrial community. You know how companies say, we're like a family here? Well, Eastman literally wanted that to be the case, because, well, he was hiring family members. That was the whole point. He felt if everyone was working together as a family, it would be better for the company. Rather than just saying that and not actually being so in the modern day, Eastman was trying to create it, and also being somewhat racist at the same time. But, 1920s, hey! And such practices, as well as excluding African Americans and Jews, weren't seriously challenged by people until after World War II. That whole Holocaust thing tended to change people's outlook on Jewish individuals for the most part. And the Civil Rights Movement, of course, opened up a lot of doors for African Americans. Anyway, I've gotten way off track. Kodak didn't reach their peak until the post-war era. Because after World War II, particularly in America, people had a lot of extra money, and the idea of owning a personal camera to take pictures was greatly enhanced. The technology was a lot better, and basically, people just needed more film. The usage of it for amateur, commercial, and government purposes spiked. And they even made cameras for NASA in use in space exploration. Between 1936 and 1966, they doubled their number of employees worldwide. And as time went on, they still continued the idea of offering higher wages and more benefits than labor market competitors. They added on annual wage dividends and bonuses, making their workforce exceedingly loyal to the company. They liked working there because the company actually took care of them, actually paid them a living wage, even more than a living wage. If you worked for Kodak, you were doing really well. And on the corporate side, they really didn't have to alter their business model hardly at all until the 1970s. But technology was changing, and the computer industry was coming into the fold. This was something that Kodak was interested in, but didn't really know how to apply it because computers didn't use film, and more importantly, digital cameras didn't. Kodak's R&D focused on products that were related directly to their core business, the film, and that meant they fell behind in other categories. Both Polaroid and Xerox had developed things like instant cameras and photocopiers, which Kodak did follow up on, but their versions of that tech didn't catch on like the others, and both product lines were abandoned by the 1990s. Then, in 1975, a Kodak employee named Steven Sasson was able to develop the first handheld digital camera. This was a groundbreaking achievement. As we all know, digital cameras are, well, digital. You don't need film at all. But that was kind of the issue. They didn't need film, and Kodak was concerned about threatening their core business at the time, though they were aware that it was likely at some point in the future that things would shift to digital. One of their own employees again, named Larry Madelson, wrote a report in 1979 that predicted a complete shift to digital photography that would occur by 2010, which is pretty accurate in retrospect. Now this is the point in the story where people tend to laugh at Kodak, realizing, hey, these fools, they didn't see the future. Well, no, that wasn't the problem. The problem was twofold. They were afraid of their core business model, but in those days, selling a digital camera really didn't seem like a good idea. You have to understand, yeah, Steven Sasson had made the first handheld digital camera, but let's talk about that camera. It was as large as a toaster, took 20 seconds to actually take an image, had very low quality compared to film, and required complicated connections to show the pictures on a television to view. Because, well, if you've used a digital camera, you're like, yeah, you just plug it into a computer. It was 1975. Computers looked like this, with displays like this. You couldn't put a picture on it. You couldn't print a picture on it. The technology just wasn't mature. Kodak had it and could utilize it, but not at that time. Doing so would require heavy investment. A lot of money would have to go into this, and they'd be kneecapping their own film business, plus they'd be in direct competition with established firms that were already working on computer hardware. Kodak didn't feel they were ready for that. Under CEOs Colby Chandler and Kay Whitmore, they instead tried to diversify their chemical operations. This makes sense. Kodak is, at their core, actually a chemical company. You need that chemical background to make the film in the first place, and they wanted to push more into that market. A lot of those new projects were given very large budgets, but there wasn't any planning for the long term, and they didn't call in any outside experts to help them with it. Most of them resulted in large losses for the company. They also tried to diversify into the drug market, purchasing the Sterling Drug Company in 1988 at a cost of $5.1 billion, a huge investment. But the drug company was overvalued and proceeded to lose them money. It wasn't successful at all. It was a complete waste of all that cash. But during the 80s, Kodak was not stupid. Again, they were aware that digital technology was going to be relevant, and if they wanted to still make cameras, they better look into it. So during the 80s, R&D at Kodak Research Laboratories was directed at the digital technology, which laid the groundwork for them to have a smooth transition into digital once the market opened up for it. But even in their core business during the 80s, things were changing for the company, and this was most of their problem. It wasn't that Kodak didn't know about shifts to digital. It was that there were other companies that were actually starting to compete with them very easily. And the most difficult ones all tended to come from the same place. Japan. Japanese companies were getting a strong foothold in America at about that time, and one particular competitor named Fujifilm, whose name you've probably seen before, entered the US market during the 80s. The thing was, Fujifilm, while it was still film and decent quality, it was lower priced. They undercut Kodak, and even defeated them in a bidding war to become the official film of the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics. This solidified Fujifilm's permanent place in the American market, and that was a big threat to Kodak, because they had ruled undisputed in the film market for almost a century. And now the Japanese were like, hello! We're here! Do you like our anime? Buy our film! Fujifilm even opened a plant in the United States and ran aggressive marketing and price-cutting campaigns, robbing Kodak of some of their market share. Fujifilm rose from a 10% share in 1990 to 17% in 97. That's a fairly big change in that amount of time. And Kodak's response to all this was to follow along with what the shareholders told them. And by that I mean anger all their employees. You remember when I said Kodak was a great place to work? Yeah, it was. Well, in order to save money, they started cutting benefits and making large layoffs. The layoffs on one hand I kind of understand, but the benefits? Yo, the employees that stay are gonna be really mad at you. And they were. While Kodak's revenues increased during the 90s, they were still losing out in their market share compared to Fuji, and Kodak responded by slashing their own prices in 97, but that cut into their profit margin significantly, losing over $1 billion in 1997 compared to the previous year. But what about the digital stuff? It is the 90s. People were going to stop using film, right? And yeah, that was slowly coming up too. In 1993, Kay Whitmore announced that they would restructure themselves, and then he was succeeded by George M.C. Fisher as CEO later that same year. Fisher came over from Motorola. As such, he had a background in tech, and he knew the time was now to start pushing into the digital market. Under him, they abandoned the diversification in their chemicals and started an incremental shift over to digital technology. By 2001, film sales finally began to fall. So under their new CEO, Daniel Karp, Kodak made an aggressive push into digital cameras, producing their EasyShare family. It actually went really well for them. See, this is why the tale about them rejecting digital and sticking with film, and that's what killed them, is wrong. It really had nothing to do with that. By 2005, Kodak ranked number 1 in the US in digital camera sales. They were doing really well in the market. The problem was a few things. Other than all those bad investments costing them so much money over the years, the fact was that selling digital cameras was a lot different than selling film cameras because they no longer had the film market to fall back on. Once people bought a digital camera, they really didn't need to buy anything else from the company, at least not nearly as often or with such a high profit margin. And digital cameras in and of themselves had very low profit margins because of competition. Plenty of companies were manufacturing digital cameras, and Kodak was just one. Yes, they were number 1, but pretty soon other companies from Japan again, Canon, Sony, and Nikon, all entered the market with cameras that were pretty good but cheaper than Kodak's. By 2007, Kodak had dropped to number 4 in the US digital camera sales, but a bigger problem laid on the horizon. See, digital cameras are nice and neat and wonderful, but soon they themselves would become obsolete.
And we are calling it iPhone. Today, Apple is going to reinvent the phone.
Yeah, I don't know if most of you know this, and I bet you do, but everyone has a decent camera in their pocket now. There are some models of modern phones that have incredible cameras and can do a whole bunch of other things. The idea of having a dedicated digital camera, there was still a small market for it, but it was just that small. And this was a pretty serious problem for them. They were losing money. Under Antonio Perez as CEO, they began shutting down factories and outsourcing multiple divisions, or eliminating them. They divested their own digital camera manufacturing operations to Flextronics in August of 2006, and that included assembly, production, and testing. They weren't doing any of it anymore. They exited the film camera market altogether, and in total, 13 plants and 130 photo finishing facilities were shut down, and 50,000 people were laid off between 2004 and 2007. In 2009, Kodak announced that they would cease selling Kodachrome color film, which ended 74 years of production. But Perez wasn't just about shutting things down, he was looking to push into other avenues for the company. He spent hundreds of millions of dollars to build up a high-margin printer ink business to replace the falling film sales because people still needed printers. This was a bold but risky venture. There was a lot of competition in that market already. Kodak was a newcomer. However, they had a trick up their sleeve in this category. See, for a long time, computer printers still used the same exact business model that Kodak had used with the film, the razor and blades. The printers themselves were usually sold at a pretty decent price, but the ink cartridges were insane. Kodak decided, if we're gonna make any headway here, what if we do the opposite? Kodak's printers were often pretty highly priced, but they were pretty nice, and more importantly, they sold the ink cartridges for way less than any of the other printer manufacturers. That was a big draw for people who, by that time, had noticed that they were kind of getting taken for a ride in the whole ink cartridge thing. Kodak didn't charge an arm and a leg for their cartridges, so it made investing in a more expensive printer kind of appealing when in the long run it would actually save you money. In 2011, they were said to be on the verge of turning a profit in this avenue, but by 2012, they suffered more declining sales and they were forced to exit from the consumer inkjet market. Their value as a company continued to decline, and then in 2009 they had to take a $300 million loan from KKR. They began selling off divisions left and right to try to repay debts from previous investments that hadn't worked out, and that even included Kodak Health Group. But they made $2.35 billion from the sale, and they were able to repay their approximately $1.15 billion of secured term debt. In a desperate bid to try to generate any kind of revenue to stay afloat, they turned to patent litigation. In 2010, they received $838 million from patent licensing that included a settlement with LG. Between 2010 and 2012, Kodak and Apple sued each other. in multiple patent infringement lawsuits. This did generate some revenue in some places, but they were also spending a lot of money on legal fees, so it wasn't exactly a winning strategy in the grand scheme of things. And by 2011, they were rapidly burning through their cash reserves. They only had $957 million in cash remaining in June of 2011, and I know that sounds like a lot because it is. But for a company of Kodak's size, it wasn't. That was down from $1.6 billion in 2001, and it was still falling. They began exploring selling off or licensing their vast portfolio of patents to try to generate some cash. But by 2012, analysts suggested that they could enter bankruptcy very soon, and they weren't wrong. On January 19th, 2012, Kodak filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection and obtained a $950 million 18-month credit facility from Citigroup to enable them to continue their operations. Under the terms, Kodak had a deadline of February 15, 2013 to produce a reorganization plan. This is where people tend to stop following the story, as they assume if they entered bankruptcy, they must have liquidated. No, Kodak's still around, like I said. They turned in their plan for reorganization ahead of schedule in January of 2013, and the plan called for them to exit from bankruptcy by mid-2013. In order to make a lot of money really fast, they were forced to sell a lot of their patents, and they ceased the production of multiple products. And though they did eventually emerge from bankruptcy on September 3rd, 2013, they were a shell of what they once were. They focused on being a technology company that specialized in imaging for businesses, not the general public. And their fall was especially damaging to the Rochester area, which for a long time had depended on them for, gainful employment. The jobs that Kodak had offered were still very highly paid, and most of them were replaced with lower paying jobs, contributing to a much higher poverty rate there. So what's Kodak doing now? If they're still around, where are they? Well, by 2016, they reported their first annual profit since bankruptcy. And in recent years, most of what they've been doing is licensing their own brand, because people recognize the name, to other companies. Those licensing fees have generated a whole bunch of revenue they didn't have before. They did idiotically try to get into cryptocurrency in 2018 with the Kodak coin and the Kodak cash miner. It was a failure. It was dumb, and they're their own story. We don't have to talk about that here. And on top of the licensing arrangements, what they still do is actually make film. They still produce film even now, because there are places that still need it. They supply film to the motion picture industry after signing new agreements with major studios in 2015 and 2020. And as recently as 2022, they plan to hire new film technicians after film photography experienced a bit of a revival in the hobbyist market. Much like with other things, people like old school. The digital stuff is nice, but it's not the same. And film is an interesting hobby to take advantage of. And Kodak, despite their missteps, was able to stay alive in order to be here for it. Unlike a lot of the other company falls, Kodak fell but didn't die. They're still alive even now, doing things differently, but in more recent years they've been able to start going back more to their roots and make film again. It likely won't turn them into a multi-billion-dollar company like they once were, and I'm sure they'll investigate other avenues of growth, but the fact that they can still make the film and make money off of it and continue to exist is actually kind of a nice ending, given that a lot of other companies aren't so fortunate. And with that, a special thank you to all my underwater train finders, SomeDude267, Benjamin Owens, Anzac A1, Arthur Roy, Jack Carson's Railroad Videos, Lord R 444, Iser for 1405, Charles Kwiatkowski, Matt Weaver, Tom Redlion, NS Productions 8104, Wheeljack 8401, Rescues Greyhounds, The Baxter, Caleb Crosswhite, Josh Johnson, Caleb Brainwaters, Prez Drenton, Master of None, Travis Alinsky, JBL Explorers, Tommy Rossini, Ben McCullough, Panzer Kitsune 131-232, Mark Holding, G. Wiz, Mr. Terrevel, Hayden DeGrow, No, Kurt Forkham, Mr. Sleepy, Harry, Drew Debris, George Kenny, Kevin Wood, Liam Wright, Hendrick Motorsports Fan 5, Hannah Bird, Duralshi, A. Person 723, William Nemo, Dr. Racer 78, Shimasu, Eric Hutton, NJ 1969, Metal for Life Guy, Andrew Bowen, Crimson Rose, Ryan Wehofer, Jared Brussel, Zintac M, Boss K, Orange Glass, Andy, The Conceptualist, Acoletti, Ohio Trucker 1, Windy City Rails, and of course, my dad. Till next time, this is Darkness, an individual of fun. Farewell.